She opens her back door to find a mother bobcat and her cubs trembling at 48 degrees. One moment's hesitation, and they will all succumb to the lethal cold. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind roared across the frozen plains like a living thing, cutting through even the thickest winter coats and driving needles of ice into exposed skin. For days, a relentless cold front had battered the region, plummeting temperatures to an astonishing 48 degrees. Nothing moved easily in such lethal conditions. Cars refused to start, and livestock clustered together for warmth beneath hastily rigged shelters. In this fierce winter landscape, survival was a constant battle, one that a mother bobcat had been fighting every hour for the sake of her two cubs. Born in a shallow den between ancient pines, the cubs had known only cold and hunger since the day their eyes opened. Their mother, a wiry female with a ragged scar across her muzzle, had successfully mated in the final days of autumn, unaware that this winter would arrive with uncommon savagery. Now, her once trustworthy hunting grounds lay hidden under a sea of crusted snow, the trails of rabbits and grouse vanishing beneath endless drifts. Each day demanded more of her cunning and courage as she searched for any scrap of sustenance to keep her cubs alive. Often she would leave them tucked against her warm belly under a low rock outcrop, then wander farther than she ever had before, scanning the silent white horizon. She'd had success in the early weeks, catching enough small game to stave off starvation. But as December turned into January and the temperature plunged lower than any local had seen in decades, even the bravest creatures disappeared into deep burrows or left for kinder climates. The mother bobcat's paw pads cracked with frost, yet she pressed on, motivated by the feeble mewls of her cubs whenever she returned, their eyes begging for the comfort of food. Each time she crawled back into the small den, she found them weaker, more desperate, their little bodies trembling from the cold that seeped into their bones. But instinct could only do so much. On the fourth day of an unrelenting blizzard, one cub began to show signs of hypothermia, its breath coming in faint gasps. The mother nudged her offspring in a futile attempt to stir some heat, wrapping her body as best she could around the both of them. Yet she felt the creeping numbness in her limbs. The slow drain of energy that signaled her own reserves were dangerously low. They could not survive another night without shelter, real shelter that offered more than just a windbreak. At dusk, the sky momentarily cleared, revealing a faint rosy glow on the horizon. The mother bobcat seized the moment. Lifting her ailing cub by the scruff, she looked to the other, giving a soft growl that signaled it to follow. With each exhaled breath crystallizing before her face, she stepped out into the deep drifts. She had hunted these fields often and understood that a place called human territory lay just beyond a line of twisted pines. She had always avoided it. The scent of humans, with their clanging machines and unfamiliar smells, was unnerving. But she also knew one fact that overcame her fear. Human spaces offered warmth. Sometimes she had spotted heat billowing from vents and smoke rising from chimneys. In a winter like this, it might be their only chance to survive. The trek was a small odyssey. Each step sank her deeper into the snow, forcing her to leap with her front paws to create a path. The second cub trailed behind, struggling to match the larger paw prints. Twilight melted into darkness, and soon all that remained was the moon's silvery glow reflecting off the endless expanse of white. Despite her exhaustion, the mother bobcat kept going, alert for any sign of predators. Wolves roamed these parts, as did coyotes, each hungry enough to gamble on a confrontation. She turned her head frequently to ensure her trailing cub wasn't lost in the gloom. Once or twice, she paused, whiskers twitching, as a distant howl echoed. Only when it faded would she resume. After hours of walking, her limbs burned, and her breath came in ragged huffs. At last, the ragged silhouettes of human buildings emerged from the sheets of moonlit snow. She saw a fence line first, half buried in frost, and beyond it, a faint square of yellow light. The scent of smoke drifted in the air. That light meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. She steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. Another frosty gust of wind howled across the open ground, biting at her ears and the tender paws of her cubs. The little ones cried softly, too cold to do more than whimper. Within minutes, the mother bobcat reached the edge of a large farmhouse. Wood siding groaned under the weight of accumulated ice, and the windows glowed with soft lamplight. She circled the structure cautiously, stepping past a rusted shovel and multiple footprints left by the house's occupants. A half-frozen wind chime clinked overhead, startling the smaller cub. The mother hissed, tail twitching, but remained focused. Then she found it. A narrow crawl space beneath a porch partially blocked by stacked firewood. The smell of slightly warmer air drifted out. No dog scent lingered, which was a promising sign. She guided her cubs into that cramped darkness, setting the weaker one down against a patch of thawed earth. Though meager, the space offered relief from the knife-edged wind. Both cubs pressed against her for heat, mewling pitifully. As she tried to lick the ice from the fur of her weaker youngster, she realized that time was running out. Despite their new refuge, the cold was too intense, the temperature dropping further as night advanced. Here they might last until morning, but if they did not find warmth or nourishment, the difference between life and death was a matter of hours. Inside the farmhouse, Lydia Connolly was stirring a pot of thick stew on an old cast-iron stove. She had lived on this land for over 40 years and prided herself on reading nature's signs. The unusual severity of this winter had taken even her by surprise. She had done her best to prepare, stocking up on firewood, extra blankets, and enough provisions for a long siege of cold. But even with all her preparations, tonight felt ominous. Outside, the beams creaked in protest as another icy blast struck, and Lydia tightened her shawl around her shoulders, glancing at the old radio perched on the counter. It spit out static-laced weather updates, warnings of frostbite in under 5 minutes of exposure, urgent reminders to stay indoors. She had just finished pouring a mug of tea when a soft thump echoed from beneath the floorboards. Frowning, she set down her cup. The house sometimes settled in the cold, but that sound had an unexpected resonance. Another thump followed, coupled with a faint scratching. Whatever it wasn't the usual groan of the old timber. Heart quickening, Lydia grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the back door, curiosity outweighing her caution. Opening the door a crack, she braced herself against the swirling wind that tore at her hair and stung her cheeks. Her flashlight beam cut across the snow, landing on nothing but the drifting whiteness. Still she heard it, a muted scratching, as if something was under the porch. Teeth chattering, Lydia inched her way down the steps. Even with her heavy coat, the cold was punishing, seizing her breath and making her eyes water. She called out a soft greeting, more a habit of kindness than any real expectation of an answer. Then, crouching low, she aimed the flashlight into the crawl space. Her eyes widened at the sight. A pair of gleaming eyes reflected her beam, and faintly behind them, 2 smaller sets glowed like tiny lanterns. The mother bobcat, half frozen, stared back with equal parts defiance and desperation. Beneath the porch, Lydia's flashlight revealed a scene that knotted her stomach with both awe and concern. The mother bobcat stood protectively in front of 2 cubs, every muscle tense as she glared up at the source of the light. Though Lydia's heart thundered, she remained as still as possible, hoping not to provoke a desperate attack. She could see the animal's ragged fur, the unmistakable signs of exposure, and the barely restrained panic in the mother's posture. An instinct to flee kept the bobcat's body rigid, but exhaustion clung to her like a heavy shawl. Lydia realized they were all in peril. Lydia switched off the flashlight and let her eyes adjust to the darkness, aware that the sudden brightness could frighten the bobcat further. Her own breath seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Another gust of wind sliced across the yard, carrying fresh flakes of snow in swirling eddies. The mother bobcat hissed softly, then shifted her weight to shield her cubs from the biting cold. The cubs pressed closer to their mother, each trembling in the sub-zero air. Lydia knew she had precious little time. If she left them out here, they'd likely freeze before dawn. But how could she help? For decades, Lydia's late husband had served as a ranger in these parts, always reminding her of nature's delicate balance. Yet he also believed that compassion, wielded wisely, was part of that balance. Scenes of him returning with half-frozen strays flooded her mind, memories of warming them by the stove until they gained enough strength to survive. Tonight she felt his spirit near, urging her to do something. There was no question. She wouldn't simply abandon these creatures. With a soft murmur, she took a step back, hoping to show she meant no threat. The bobcat's eyes tracked her warily. Inside, Lydia rummaged for an old blanket, one that retained a trace of her husband's scent, though she couldn't be sure if that might soothe or frighten a wild animal. She grabbed a handful of leftover roast from the fridge, uncertain whether the starving bobcat would accept human food in such a dire state. In the glow of her kitchen lamp, she paused, realizing she had no clear plan to bring them indoors. For one, the bobcat might lash out, cornered by unfamiliar walls, and the cat was still a lethal predator when pressed, but perhaps she could lure them somewhere safe. Her mind landed on the old mudroom at the side of the house, a small enclosed space with a separate entrance. It stored boots, coats, and tools, but crucially, it had a working heater she'd never bothered to turn off because of the pipeline's risk of freezing. If she could coax the bobcat family inside without forcing a confrontation, she might give them a fighting chance until she could call the local wildlife rescue. She fashioned a makeshift bed of the blanket on the mudroom floor and propped the door open just enough for a curious creature to slip through. Bundling up in her warmest coat, Lydia approached the crawl space once more. She kept her movement slow, her voice gentle, knowing wild animals often read body language more fluently than humans. Holding out a piece of roast in her gloved hand, she crouched low. The mother bobcat's head jerked up, eyes locking on Lydia's silhouette. Another hiss escaped the cat's throat, but she didn't move away. Hunger, combined with concern for her cubs, weighed heavily in her expression. The wind swelled, fluttering Lydia's scarf and sending a fresh shiver through the bobcat's fur. No matter how she tried, Lydia couldn't stay outside for long. With painstaking caution, Lydia set the meat on the snow near the porch steps and backed away. The mother bobcat watched, nostrils flaring, as the scent drifted her way. One cub let out a feeble cry, spurring the mother to sniff the air more intently. For a moment, there was a standoff, neither woman nor bobcat sure of the other's intentions. Then the mother took a careful step forward, her entire frame coiled to bolt at the slightest threat. She reached the morsel and gobbled it down with surprising speed, ears flat but eyes never leaving Lydia. Encouraged, Lydia retreated farther, then placed another piece of roast, this time on the threshold leading into the mudroom. She left the door cracked and slipped inside. Now all she could do was wait. From behind a corner, she peered out the side window, watching the darkness. Minutes trickled by, marked by the howling wind. At last she saw movement. The mother bobcat emerged from under the porch, stepping gingerly through the snow, the cubs trailing hesitantly behind. The older cub stumbled and she paused to nudge it upright. Despite her caution, need was winning. A wave of relief swept through Lydia. Slowly, the feline trio inched closer to the mudroom. The second cub gave a desperate mewl, and the mother's ears flattened in response. perhaps sensing that each step deeper into human territory invited unknown dangers. Yet the promise of warmth and food was too strong. They passed the threshold, crossing into the faint glow of the overhead light. Once inside, they froze again, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar smells of rubber boots and old cleaning solutions. Lydia watched, heart pounding, as the mother tested the air, then herded her cubs to the far corner where they instinctively huddled on the blanket's warmth. Ever so carefully, Lydia shut the door against the bitter wind, sealing the mudroom from the outdoors. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned within her: relief that the bobcats were at least temporarily safe, fear that she'd brought a wild predator within feet of her living space, and a fierce resolve to see them through this crisis. The mother bobcat's gaze seared through the gloom, challenging Lydia with every flick of her tail. It was not submission, but a guarded acceptance of her dire circumstances. Lydia understood they were walking a perilous line. She had one night to save them, or risk losing everything she cherished about the wilderness she loved. Lydia remained still for a few moments, breathing shallowly as she mustered her nerve. She could practically feel the mother bobcat's tension emanating across the small space. The cubs, now on the blanket, emitted tiny whimpers that punctured the silence. Despite the swirling anxiety in her gut, Lydia forced herself to think methodically. They were here. They were alive. But the next steps were critical. Bracing herself, she inched forward, stopping whenever the mother hissed. As gently as she could, she slid a shallow dish of water across the floor. The mother bobcat bared her teeth at first, ears flattened, but her eyes flicked toward the water's reflection. The cubs, drawn by thirst, began to shuffle on unsteady legs. When one tiny paw slipped on the linoleum, it let out a plaintive cry, which seemed to rip the last thread of Lydia's composure. She wanted to scoop them up and wrap them in warm towels, but she knew better. Approaching too directly could trigger the mother's defense. Instead, Lydia backed out of the mudroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. She retrieved her cell phone from the kitchen counter, intending to call the local wildlife rescue hotline. The phone rang 6 times before a pre-recorded message informed her that after-hours service was available only in life-or-death emergencies and to leave a voicemail. Lydia pressed the phone to her ear, casting an anxious glance toward the mudroom. She whispered a hurried explanation of the situation: the sub-zero temperatures, a mother bobcat with 2 cubs, urgent need for guidance. Then she hung up, her heart pounding. No immediate help, she thought grimly. She checked the digital thermometer by the window. It read 47 degrees C and falling. Stepping toward the mudroom again, she spotted the mother bobcat lapping water, while the cubs, emboldened by thirst, took turns dipping their tiny pink tongues. The mother's muscles remained coiled, every flick of her tail revealing that she was poised to bolt or fight if threatened. Yet she made no move to leave. Lydia could almost feel the war raging inside that sleek feline body. Fear of humans versus the instinct to protect her offspring from certain death in the cold. A sense of awe filled Lydia. Whatever the mother bobcat felt, she'd chosen this gamble for her cubs, a testament to the raw power of maternal devotion. Lydia recalled stories her husband had shared about animal rescues in brutal winters. He always maintained there was a thin line between the wild and the human world, a line sometimes crossed when survival hung in the balance. She left more pieces of leftover roast on a paper plate, sliding them to a safe distance. Then, pulling on a pair of heavy gloves, she quietly placed a portable space heater near the mudroom's far wall, facing it away so it wouldn't blow hot air directly on the frightened cats. Once she plugged it in, the heater began to emit a low hum, gradually pushing back the worst of the chill. The mother watched with unblinking eyes, suspicious but clearly reluctant to abandon the new source of warmth. Lydia stayed crouched, her breath unsteady, and then withdrew again. Hours passed in a tense stalemate. Outside, the wind reached a maddening pitch, rattling the windows and sending swirling drifts piling against the doors. Inside the mudroom, the Bobcat family remained huddled near the heater's gentle glow. Lydia sipped lukewarm tea to calm her nerves, occasionally peeking around the doorframe. Each time she found the mother's gaze pinned on her, as if to say, "This is as close as you dare." By midnight, Lydia had checked her phone repeatedly for missed calls or messages from the rescue center. Nothing. She left another voicemail, her tone more urgent, then set her phone on the counter. The swirling storm outside made it almost impossible to consider driving anywhere, and she doubted any rescue team could brave the roads until morning. Resigned, she prepared for the possibility of an unusual houseguest for the night. Every so often, she would catch distant sounds, a scraping of claws against the door, or a weak mew from one of the cubs. Each time she rose from the old armchair where she'd dozed off, only to find that mother and cubs were still tucked in the same corner. Perhaps the mother had realized Lydia wasn't attacking, and that her greatest enemy now was the merciless winter raging beyond the mudroom walls. The scraps of meat and the dish of water were nearly consumed, and Lydia resolved to refresh them before dawn. She finally fell into an uneasy sleep around 2 a.m, wrapped in blankets by the kitchen stove, her mind half alert to any threat. Though she'd known severe winters all her life, this felt unlike anything she'd experienced. Danger so intense it had driven a wild predator to seek refuge in a human home. She wondered if this was a once-in-a-generation storm, the kind that tested the boundaries of every living creature's endurance. At first light, Lydia woke with a stiff neck and a sense of disorientation. The wind had eased just enough for the radio to blare static-laden bulletins about ongoing road closures and record-setting temperatures. Pulling herself upright, she tiptoed toward the mudroom. She braced for chaos. Perhaps the Bobcat had broken free, or the cubs had caused havoc. Instead, she found a silent tableau. The mother lay on her side, muzzle resting on her paws. The cubs, curled into her warmth, stirred at Lydia's approach, their limbs twitching from some dream beyond that frozen reality. One cub blinked, and Lydia could see exhaustion etched in its tiny face. Relieved to find them still calm, she slowly replaced the water dish with fresh, slightly warmed water and left another small plate of meat scraps. The mother lifted her head, sniffed the air, and then let out a soft yowl, more a complaint than a threat. Lydia's eyes widened. The cat was clearly weak, her movement slowed, yet something flashed in those eyes, a primal resolve that refused to let her die here. Lydia decided to try calling again. This time, a groggy voice answered, and Lydia spilled out the story. The operator on the other end was stunned. Bobcats rarely ventured so close to dwellings under normal conditions, let alone with cubs. But the operator acknowledged the unparalleled severity of the cold. She promised to send a local wildlife officer as soon as the roads were deemed passable. They may not make it out there until midday, she warned, sympathy threading her tone. Lydia thanked her and ended the call, a weight lifting from her chest. Returning to the mudroom, Lydia observed the mother bobcat sniffing the fresh water and meat. The animal's ribcage was painfully visible, each breath shallow. One cub nuzzled its mother, then turned to lap water. Lydia found herself murmuring reassurances, half to herself, half in the hope that her voice might become a calm presence. Suddenly, the mother bobcat looked straight at Lydia, a long, searching stare. In that moment, Lydia could almost believe the cat understood her intentions. Two mothers, different species, bound by the same fierce instinct to protect the vulnerable. As dawn brightened the edges of the sky, the temperature dipped even lower, as though nature was defying the sun's weak attempts to lend warmth. Frost marbled the windows, and beneath the porch the snowdrifts had formed a solid, unyielding wall. Lydia stood in the kitchen, checking on the mother bobcat and her cubs every few minutes. She hadn't heard back from the local wildlife officer yet, but at least she knew someone was aware of her plight. The only question was whether help would arrive in time. Her mind flicked to other possibilities: a neighbor with a sturdy truck, a friend in town with a snowmobile, or maybe the volunteer firefighters who patrolled these remote roads. But each option presented the same obstacle. Nobody wanted to risk the roads in such brutal cold if it wasn't absolutely necessary. The last report she'd heard on the radio claimed several vehicles had already frozen along the highway, their batteries and fuel lines immobilized in the unprecedented chill. Stranded at home, Lydia accepted that the responsibility for these wild creatures' safety rested squarely on her shoulders, at least for now. She carried a fresh bowl of warmed water into the mudroom. The mother bobcat growled softly, her ears pinned back, but she no longer appeared as fierce or ready to spring. Lydia watched as the cubs, still trembling, tried to clamber over their mother's hindquarters, their mewling a heart-wrenching sound. Even with the portable heater, the room felt brisk. She'd upped the thermostat for the entire house, hoping some of that warmth might seep through the connecting door. When one cub ventured to lap at the water, Lydia noticed its coat clumped together where ice had melted and refrozen. She realized, with a pang of sympathy, that the cubs had likely wandered through deep snow for hours before stumbling onto her porch. Marveling that they were still alive, she prayed they had enough strength to recover from exposure. Every so often, she spoke in low, reassuring tones, not because she believed the bobcat understood her words, but because her presence, used gently, might become less alarming. She retreated whenever the mother's tension mounted. Their silent agreement was to allow a certain nearness without crossing the invisible boundary that defined Lydia as other and potentially dangerous. She admired the mother's vigilance. No matter how weak the female appeared, she refused to lower her guard. By mid-morning, Lydia's phone rang. Scrambling to answer, she nearly knocked over a cup of tea in her haste. The call was from the wildlife officer, a man named Frank Delgado. Speaking in a steady, professional tone, he explained that a massive blockade of snow still clogged the main roads. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't get through the drifts until the county plows made another pass. "I might be able to borrow a snowmobile," he said, "but I need to clear it with my supervisor. Can you hold out until then?" Lydia bit her lip, her gaze drifting to the mudroom door. "I have no choice," she admitted. "They're hanging on, but the mother is weak, and the cubs, they can't be more than a few weeks old." Frank exhaled into the receiver. "Try to keep them as warm as possible. Avoid sudden movements, and don't let them into the rest of the house. Keep them contained. I'll call you as soon as I have an ETA." When the call ended, Lydia found herself staring at the phone. She felt a measure of relief in knowing help would eventually come, tempered by the worry that eventually might be too late. Glancing at the window, she saw fresh gusts swirling the snow into ghostly shapes that swooped across the fields. The whole world outside seemed caught in a suspended hush, the relentlessness of the wind draining it of life and color. She decided to gather a few more supplies: a proper heating pad, extra blankets, even a bag of cat litter in case the bobcat or her cubs needed some semblance of a restroom. Though it felt surreal to treat them like domestic pets, she reasoned that any measures to keep them stable were worth a try. She rummaged through a closet in the hallway, pulling out items she hadn't touched in years. At one point, she found a pair of thick wool socks that had belonged to her husband. She paused, tears pricking her eyes, recalling how he'd once cradled an orphan fox kit near these very steps. You never could let a creature suffer, she thought, swallowing the lump in her throat. Returning to the mudroom, she found that the mother had repositioned herself, inching closer to the space heater. The cubs sprawled on her flank, their tiny sides rising and falling with each breath. One cub lifted its head, blinking in the dim morning light, as though registering Lydia's silhouette. With gloved hands, Lydia nudged a second plate of meat a few inches nearer. She prayed the mother was strong enough to eat. The cat sniffed warily, then dragged the plate closer with a tentative paw. Her muzzle lowered, and she devoured the food with quick, desperate bites. Encouraged, Lydia slid a small heating pad across the floor, set to a low, steady temperature. She'd padded it with towels so the direct heat wouldn't be too intense. The mother growled once but didn't lunge or retreat, perhaps understanding this new object was no immediate threat. Eventually, the female turned her attention to her cubs, nudging them gently onto the warm towels. The sight tugged at Lydia's heart. These were not mindless beasts, but a family fighting to stay alive. The hours crept forward. Outside, the sun's position barely shifted behind a haze of gray clouds. Lydia forced herself to eat something, sipping at a cup of broth to keep her energy up. She checked her phone for missed calls, paced the living room, and returned to the mudroom. Each time, she saw minor progress. The cubs moved with a shade more steadiness, and the mother's eyes seemed brighter. Yet the cold pressed in from every side, a reminder that their hard-won reprieve was precarious. By early afternoon, Lydia ventured a little closer than before. At the sound of her boots squeaking on the linoleum, the mother tensed but no longer hissed. Lydia spoke softly, offering quiet words of encouragement. She didn't dare extend a hand. Even a weak bobcat could strike with dangerous force. But in her own way, Lydia tried to bridge the chasm between them. "It's all right," she murmured. "Help's coming." The mother blinked, though Lydia couldn't say whether it was incomprehension or just coincidence. 15 minutes later, her phone rang again. This time, Frank's voice resonated with a hopeful lilt. He'd managed to borrow a snowmobile from a rancher. He would load it onto a truck and attempt to get as close as possible by road. Where the plows stopped, he would switch to the snowmobile and navigate the rest of the journey. "Best case scenario," he said. "I can be there in 3 hours." Lydia thanked him repeatedly, relief coursing through her. 3 hours felt like a lifetime, but it was also a tangible commitment. She could handle that. She relayed the update to the bobcat, half laughing at herself for speaking to an animal that likely saw her as both savior and potential threat. But the act eased her nerves. She set about readying the house for Frank's arrival, clearing a space near the side door, double-checking the storm shutters. Occasionally, she'd tiptoe back to check on her guests, each time feeling a pang of alarm if she heard no movement. Yet every glance revealed the same determined family, huddled in their fortress of blankets and towels. The mother bobcat's vigilance never wavered. Her eyes followed Lydia like twin embers in the gloom. The cold might have driven them into a human home, but their wildness remained intact, an undercurrent of raw survival. Watching them breathe in unison, Lydia felt her heart soften further. She understood that after this, there could be no illusions. Once the crisis passed, the mother bobcat would return to the wilderness if she had any chance. Lydia would do her best to ensure that possibility remained open, even if it meant never seeing those fierce amber eyes again. They were wild creatures, not pets to be tamed. For now, they existed in a temporary alliance, each dependent on the other to make it through this lethal winter. Lydia paced the living room in slow, deliberate loops, glancing out the window between each circuit. The glass revealed the same stark world, fields glazed white, a bluish tint cast by the hidden sun, and wind devils scuttling across the yard. Each time she passed the mudroom door, she paused to listen. The mother bobcat's occasional growl, or a cub's soft mewl, reminded her that, for all their uneasy companionship, this was still a family in crisis. She wondered if the mother might grow impatient and try to escape if she sensed something amiss. With the storm still howling, any attempt at flight would likely prove deadly for them all. An hour slipped by, then 2, and Lydia began to fear Frank Delgado might not come. She couldn't imagine operating a snowmobile in such bitter temperatures. Machinery often froze solid when the mercury dipped below 40 degrees Scom. Her mind flitted to worst-case scenarios. Frank stranded somewhere on the highway, The snowmobile's engine locked and no rescue for any of them until the blizzard relented. She steadied herself with a breath, reminding her racing thoughts that she had no choice but to wait. Needing a task to dull her anxiety, Lydia rummaged in her kitchen cupboards for any additional food she might offer the bobcats. She eventually found a half-full bag of frozen chicken thighs. After thawing them in warm water, she laid them on a plastic tray. She knew the mother, so thin and ragged, needed every calorie she could get. The cubs, small as they were, needed nourishment to fight off the cold's relentless drain on their tiny bodies. Still, a caution tugged at her. How far should she go in feeding them? She didn't want to create dependence, yet in these conditions, that concern felt secondary to keeping them alive. Stepping into the mudroom, she pushed the tray forward. The mother bobcat lifted her head, ears twitching. The female's eyes flickered between Lydia and the plate, uncertainty etched into every tense line of her posture. Then hunger won out. With a low growl, she tore at the chicken, carefully placing pieces where the cubs could reach. Lydia watched, her heart squeezing at the sight of the mother tending her young. Even in crisis, that instinct never failed. One cub fell over while trying to grip a piece of meat, prompting the mother to pull it closer so the little one wouldn't have to venture far. Lydia retreated a few steps, choosing not to linger. She sensed a subtle shift in the mother's attitude, less outright hostility, more wary acceptance of this unusual shelter. Even so, every time Lydia drew near, the mother coiled, tail flicking in tense arcs. It was a fragile trust, forged by desperation. As soon as the crisis ended, Lydia suspected that trust would vanish, replaced by the wild cat's need to roam free. And that was how it should be. By late afternoon, the wind rattled the storm shutters with renewed force, and she began to worry about the possibility of a power outage. If the electricity went down, the space heater would die, and the house's main heating system might fail. She had a backup generator in the garage, but she hadn't tested it since autumn. Tightening her coat, she ventured outside, braving the stinging air to confirm the generator's readiness. Snow whipped across her ankles, creeping into her boots. She fumbled with the latch on the garage door, half blinded by gusts. Inside, she found the generator in its usual corner, covered by a tarp. A quick check showed it was in decent shape, though whether it would kick into gear in these temperatures remained a question. Lydia hurried back indoors, shaking off clumps of snow. While her face stung and her hands felt stiff, she realized her minor discomfort was nothing compared to what the bobcats had endured. If not for that moment of mercy, she knew they'd have been long past rescue, buried in the drifts. She let herself savor a flicker of pride, then refocused on the present. She tried the rescue hotline again, hoping for an update from Frank. The call went directly to voicemail. Her voice quavered as she left a brief message, stating that she was still waiting. Hanging up, she closed her eyes, counting to 10 to steady her nerves. She passed another hour restlessly, checking the mudroom, pacing, drinking tea to keep her hands warm. Outside, dusk was arriving early, the sky darkening into a bruised blend of purple and gray. The temperature hovered near its record low, refusing to budge. She was about to check the radio for any news when a faint rumble drifted through the windows. At first, she assumed it was the wind, but then she heard it again, a mechanical drone, distant but growing louder. Lydia's pulse kicked. Could it be Frank? She pressed her face to the glass, squinting into the swirling snow. Yes, there was movement, a silhouette approaching along the main road. Her heart soared. She grabbed her coat and hurried outside with a flashlight. The beam caught flickers of metal, and the unmistakable shape of a snowmobile emerged, fighting against the icy terrain. Lydia waved her arms, and after a few moments, Frank pulled up, his breath visible even through his thick scarf. He wore a heavy-duty parka and goggles flecked with frost, giving him the look of an Arctic explorer. Switching off the engine, he climbed down, nearly stumbling as he braced himself against a savage gust of wind. "Good to see you," Lydia shouted over the roaring air. Frank nodded, clapping his gloved hands to shake off snow. Together they hurried to the house, leaning into the wind to keep from toppling. The moment the door closed behind them, they both exhaled in relief at the relative warmth. Lydia peeled off her gloves and offered Frank a seat in the kitchen. He removed his goggles, revealing reddened eyes. "Roads are worse than I expected," he murmured, voice rough from cold. "Had to abandon my truck way back, then take the snowmobile the rest of the way. You all right?" She nodded, gesturing toward the mudroom. "We're holding on, but the mother bobcat is weak. Both cubs, too. They've eaten, though. I think that's a good sign." Frank shed his parka, revealing the wildlife officer's uniform underneath. He took a moment to thaw, rubbing his arms briskly before digging into a duffel bag he'd brought. "I have sedatives, carriers, some supplies. Let's see what we can do. If she's cooperative, we'll transport them to a rehab center. If she's too far gone, I might have to—" Lydia stiffened. "Sedate her?" She understood the necessity, but the idea of that fierce mother rendered helpless made her uneasy. Frank's eyes softened. "We'll do whatever causes the least trauma, but if she's in no condition to travel on her own, sedation might be the only humane option. Let's check first." With Lydia leading the way, they moved carefully into the mudroom. The Bobcat family huddled in the corner, the mother's ears pricking at the intrusion. She bared her teeth, emitting a sharp growl. Frank crouched, setting his duffel on the floor. He spoke softly, his tone measured and calm. "Easy now. We're here to help." As if the cat might understand, he kept his movements slow, reaching for a flashlight to get a better look at her condition. The mother's fur stood on end, and one cub shrank behind her hind legs. Yet the cat didn't leap or lunge. She seemed exhausted, her sides rising and falling in unsteady rhythms. From Frank's practiced eye, Lydia guessed he saw signs of severe dehydration and stress, the kind that could tip either way. He took a small flashlight and angled it, examining the mother's eyes. Her pupils contracted in the light, and she hissed, but did not advance. Frank exhaled. "She's in rough shape, but I think we can move her if we're careful. I've got a crate in the truck bed, a sturdy one. We'll need to carry her out, though, the cubs too." Lydia's chest tightened. "It's that or wait for the storm to pass." He nodded grimly. "If this storm lasts a day or more, they might not survive, even with the warmth in here. And once they get strong enough, they'll be impossible to contain. A frightened bobcat can cause real harm to itself and to us." She glanced at the mother's narrowed eyes. "Then let's do it." Frank prepared a mild sedative dart, fitting it into a small air rifle. The mother bobcat let out another warning growl. Lydia's heart pounded. She prayed they weren't making a fatal mistake. In the swirling tension of the tiny room, Frank took aim, preparing for the delicate shot that might be the family's best hope. Frank squeezed the trigger, loosing a muted hiss as the tiny dart flew from the air rifle. Lydia held her breath, silently praying the dosage was correct. The mother bobcat jerked her head, eyes flaring with alarm. She snarled, springing half a step backward before the sedative began to take effect. Her hind legs trembled and she swayed, fighting the onset of sudden fatigue. The cubs scurried closer, letting out frightened mewls. A ragged growl escaped the mother's throat, but her focus wavered. Within seconds, she staggered, finally dropping to her side. A rush of pity flooded Lydia's chest. Even sedated, the bobcat's eyes remained open, as if refusing to fully surrender. Frank moved swiftly, setting the air rifle aside and opening his duffel. He withdrew thick gloves, a pair of leather gauntlets that reached nearly to his elbows, and tugged them on. With Lydia's help, he eased the mother bobcat onto a blanket. She twitched, but the sedative held. Her breathing was slow and uneven, each inhale a rattling sound that made Lydia's stomach clench. The cubs milled around her, distressed squeaks echoing in the small space. One of them, braver than the other, pawed at Frank's boot. "Gently," Lydia whispered, nodding at the frightened cubs. "We have to keep them with her." Frank nodded, scooping each cub in turn and depositing them in a separate carrier. The little ones resisted, tiny claws scratching at the plastic walls. The mother stirred when she heard their cries, a quiver passing through her muscles, but she couldn't rise. "We'll place them all together in the crate once she's secured," Frank said. "But for transport, I need to be certain she's restrained properly." Working with practiced efficiency, he folded the blanket around the mother's body, creating a makeshift swaddle that pinned her legs. Lydia slid a second blanket beneath to cushion her ribs, noticing how alarmingly thin she was. Her hip bones jutted and frostbitten patches of fur revealed raw, irritated skin. "She's so malnourished," Lydia murmured, feeling a pang of anger at the merciless cold that had forced this cat into such desperation. "We'll get her to the center," Frank replied, setting down the folded blankets. "They've got a heated enclosure and veterinary staff on call. If she stabilizes, there's a chance for release eventually. But if not—" He didn't finish the sentence. Lydia nodded gravely. She'd already confronted the possibility that the Bobcat might not pull through. At least they were giving her a chance. Together, they maneuvered the mother Bobcat into a large metal crate Frank had dragged from the truck bed outside. Once the mother was inside, he carefully transferred the cubs, letting them huddle against her still form. The tiny creatures snuggled into her fur, mewling with confusion. Observing them, Lydia felt a lump gather in her throat. She brushed it away, steeling herself for the journey ahead. "Let's move quickly," Frank urged. "It's only getting colder." Outside, the wind whipped mercilessly, flakes swirling in horizontal sheets. Frank secured the crate to a sled-like attachment behind the snowmobile. He'd used thick straps, ensuring it wouldn't jostle too much on the uneven ground. Lydia stood by, arms wrapped around herself, scanning the drifts that stretched out in every direction. Her footprints from earlier were already gone, erased by the constant gusts. It was a wonder Frank had made it here at all. "You can't ride on the snowmobile with me," Frank said, voice raised to be heard over the wind's roar. "Not enough room. Better you stay here, keep the house warm in case I have to bring them back." He shot her a sympathetic glance. "I'll contact you the moment we get them to the center." A spike of worry lanced Lydia's chest. She'd envisioned going with him, helping ensure the Bobcats arrived safely, yet she knew the trip was dangerous enough without extra weight. She gave a reluctant nod. "Please be careful. The roads are lethal." He pulled on his goggles. "You did good here," he said, patting her shoulder. "You gave them a fighting chance." Then he kicked the engine to life. The machine rumbled, spitting frosty plumes into the air. Lydia helped guide the sled, keeping it steady until Frank revved forward. She watched, heart hammering as he vanished into the swirl, the crate trailing behind. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of two small faces pressed against the crate's interior, wide-eyed with fear. Then the snow closed in, and they were gone. She stayed outside until the roar of the snowmobile faded. Turning away, she trudged back indoors, half blinded by stinging gusts. The house felt eerily quiet without the scratch of bobcat claws in the mudroom. She closed the door, leaning against it for support as a shiver overtook her. Relief, sadness, and a strange loneliness welled all at once. She wandered through the rooms, noticing tiny reminders, the towels she'd spread on the floor, the half-empty dish of water, stray bits of shredded blanket. A faint whiff of wild musk lingered in the air, reminding her that for a brief, extraordinary span of hours, this home had sheltered a mother bobcat and her cubs. Seeking distraction, Lydia poured herself a mug of coffee. She sipped slowly, letting the warmth anchor her in the present. Outside, the sky began to dim again, though it was still early evening. The storm's intensity rarely let the sun break free for long. She turned on the radio, hoping to catch news of improved conditions, but the local station offered little optimism. Drivers were urged to stay off the roads. Livestock losses were already reported to be high. She thought of the bobcats, how precarious their lives had become. The cold was a worthy adversary, relentless and uncaring. When her phone finally buzzed an hour later, she snatched it up, heart thudding. "Hello?" Her voice trembled slightly. "It's Frank," came the response. "We made it to the center. The veterinarian is examining the mother right now. She's in critical condition, but they're doing everything they can. The cubs are stable enough, no major frostbite, just mild hypothermia." Lydia exhaled, relief flooding her limbs. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "We're not out of the woods yet," he cautioned, "but they've got a heated quarantine area, IV fluids, the works. If the mother can handle the stress of sedation and rewarming, she might pull through. They'll keep the cubs near her to minimize distress." Lydia leaned against the kitchen counter, closing her eyes. "Keep me updated, please," he promised he would. After the call ended, Lydia realized her palms were damp with sweat despite the chill. The tension she'd carried for days seemed to ease. She pictured the mother bobcat, tiny cubs nuzzling her side. The memory of their frightened eyes was carved into her mind, a reminder that life could hang by the thinnest thread. That night, sleep eluded her. She tossed under heavy quilts, hearing every moan of the wind and rattle of the shutters. She recalled the mother bobcat's low growls, the trembling cub who'd stared at her from behind a frayed blanket edge. An ache swelled in her chest, a maternal empathy she'd never quite experienced before. They had crossed boundaries that day, human and wild forging a fragile alliance. Lydia could not rid herself of the haunting doubt. Had she done enough? Morning brought no respite from the cold, but a faint promise of a break in the blizzard. The radio reported that the worst of the front might be moving east. Lydia hurried to make her calls, starting with the wildlife center. She had to know if the mother was still alive. After a tense exchange of voicemails, she finally reached a staff member who offered a guarded update. The mother bobcat remained in critical care, but her vitals had stabilized overnight. The cubs were under a heat lamp, gradually regaining strength. "It's too soon to predict," the staffer cautioned, "but there's reason for optimism. She's responding to fluids, and the cubs have taken some formula. That's huge." Relief washed through Lydia, along with a bittersweet pang. She realized she might never see them again, unless by some chance of fate their paths crossed. That was the nature of true wildness. Once recovered, an animal returned to its domain, unburdened by human gratitude. Yet Lydia found comfort in imagining them roving freely through the snow-laden forest someday, guided by the mother's watchful instincts. Lydia spent the next few days in a restless state of anticipation, each morning beginning with a phone call to the wildlife center, and each evening ending with her pacing the living room. She kept her radio tuned to the weather updates. A slight warming trend was predicted by week's end, and she hoped that would aid the mother bobcat's recovery. In the quieter moments, she found herself replaying every detail. The mother's gaunt body, the cub's feeble cries, the moment the sedative took hold. Though she had lived on that homestead for decades, never before had she felt so intimately linked to a wild creature's fate. On the third morning, after another night of light sleep, Lydia's phone rang with a welcome surprise. Frank Delgado again, this time sounding more optimistic. The mother bobcat's body temperature had normalized, and she was beginning to accept small amounts of food. The cubs were active, mewling in protest whenever separated from her side. While the mother still lingered on the edge of exhaustion, there was hope. The veterinarian in charge expected a critical turning point over the next 48 hours. Either the bobcat would rally and begin a steady climb to health, or her weakened organs would fail under the strain. Lydia listened, heart in her throat, until Frank finished. "I think she might pull through," he said, exhaling in a hopeful sigh. "The cubs are little fighters, too. If you hadn't stepped in, we'd have found them out in a snowbank long after it was too late." Lydia closed her eyes, relief washing through her. She didn't fully relax, couldn't, not until she knew for certain. Still, Frank's words buoyed her spirits. After they hung up, she stood by the window, coffee mug in hand, gazing out at the yard where the Bobcat family had first appeared. It looked so ordinary now, just wind-blown drifts against the porch. Had it really been only days ago? By late afternoon, the radio predicted a slight temperature rise from a deadly 40 degrees Celsius up to a still harsh 30 degrees Celsius. Compared to the previous week's lows, it felt like a break in the clouds. Lydia ventured outside to spread extra feed for the few wild birds brave enough to remain. The cold stung her cheeks, but she noticed it wasn't as piercing as before. She took a moment to admire how the setting sun painted the snow in soft pinks and purples, a quiet kind of beauty that belied the harshness of the season. She wondered if the mother bobcat would ever see her porch again, or if, once healthy, the cat would vanish into the forest, as nature intended. The next day, Lydia received her first direct call from the veterinarian who was overseeing the bobcat's care, a woman named Dr. Patel. Her voice carried both clinical precision and genuine warmth. "She's still under close observation," Dr. Patel said, "but we've been able to keep her hydrated and she's accepting small amounts of venison. The cubs are latching onto a supplemental formula we provide, which is a good sign." Lydia hung on every word, imagining the small family in a heated enclosure, the mother perhaps still too weak to stand, her cubs crawling blindly at her side. "What happens next?" Lydia asked, her tone tentative. "If she recovers, will you release them as a family?" "That's our hope," Dr. Patel replied. "We can't make any promises, but ideally we'd keep them together, then reintroduce them to a safe habitat come spring. It depends on whether the mother regains her strength and can teach them essential survival skills. Right now, we're just taking it day by day." Touched by the vet's dedication, Lydia offered whatever help she could, though distance and winter roads limited her options. Dr. Patel thanked her for the offer and promised to keep her updated. After ending the call, Lydia realized just how entwined she'd become in this family's destiny. Each new detail seemed personal, like a relative's medical update. Her farm chores, which once carried a comforting routine, now felt like background tasks while she waited for word on the bobcat's condition. On day 5, a fresh snowfall arrived, draping the landscape in another layer of white. The wind had calmed, making it easier to shovel and clear the path to Lydia's barn. Around noon, Frank called again. "Good news," he said, a smile in his voice. "She stood up today, took a few steps around her enclosure. The cubs were right behind, squeaking up a storm. Dr. Patel thinks she's turned a corner." Lydia released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. In that exhale, she released days of pent-up dread, letting relief fill the space instead. "That's wonderful," she said, clapping a hand against her chest. She didn't need to say more. Frank understood. "Listen," Frank went on. "The vet wants to keep her in rehab for a while, at least until the cubs are older and she's hunting on her own, but we're out of the crisis. You did a good thing, Lydia." After they hung up, Lydia found herself standing by the window again, tears prickling her eyes. The yard glowed under thick, fresh snow, transformed into an almost ethereal scene. She recalled how the mother had hissed and bared her teeth that first night. Now that same fierce spirit was pushing her toward recovery. Lydia felt an unfamiliar mix of gratitude and sadness. She felt protective, Yet she knew her home had only been a stopgap, a sanctuary to bridge that deadly gap between freezing to death and living to hunt another day. 2 more weeks slipped by, each one bringing updates that the Bobcat family was growing stronger. The cubs began wrestling with each other, practicing the playful pounces that would someday serve them as hunters. The mother paced her enclosure with a restless edge, no doubt yearning for wide-open forests. Lydia used that image to comfort herself, a wildcat that refused to be broken by circumstance. Sometimes Lydia wondered if the Bobcat ever thought of the porch where she'd found refuge, or the human who had hovered at the edge of her vision, trying to help. Likely not, she admitted to herself. Wild animals didn't interpret kindness in the same manner humans did. Their survival hinged on caution and independence, not sentiment. By early February, the worst of the cold front finally passed. Temperatures hovered around 20 degrees at night, a vast improvement from the record lows. With road conditions improving, Lydia decided she'd make the trip to the wildlife center, if they would permit her to visit. The center was about 30 miles away, nestled in a more populated region with better maintained roads. She called Dr. Patel, who agreed to arrange a brief, supervised look at the Bobcat family, provided Lydia kept her distance and respected the center's minimal contact policy. Driving into town felt surreal. The drifts at the roadside were tall as fences, testifying to the brutality of the recent storms. Lydia navigated carefully, eyes ever watchful for patches of black ice. Still, the journey felt liberating after the tense days cooped up at home. She arrived to find a modest building surrounded by chain-link enclosures. Inside, she signed in and met Dr. Patel, a lean woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. They passed through corridors lined with kennels for various wildlife, injured hawks, orphaned raccoons, even a fox with a bandaged leg. The hum of activity grounded Lydia. It reminded her that nature's struggles happened constantly, not just on her porch. Dr. Patel led her to a large enclosure in the back, where the mother bobcat lay on a bed of straw. The cubs, now more active, romped on unsteady legs, occasionally batting each other's ears with soft paws. From behind reinforced glass, Lydia observed them. The mother's coat looked healthier, though a few patches of missing fur still marked her ordeal. One cub pressed its nose against the glass, tiny whiskers quivering. Lydia had to restrain an impulse to reach out. Dr. Patel stood beside her, arms folded. "She's mending," the vet said quietly. "We're lucky you intervened when you did." Lydia swallowed the lump in her throat. The mother bobcat turned her head, eyes passing over Lydia without a flicker of recognition. That wild stare was mesmerizing, steady, proud, and unafraid. Lydia felt her chest tighten, remembering the fear that once filled those same eyes. Now they reflected only an animal's pure, resolute spirit. She stood there for a long moment, awash in a quiet sense of awe. They had been 2 mothers caught in a brutal winter's grip, each relying on instincts to keep the young alive. Now, the worst was behind them. The day after Lydia's brief visit, the weather shifted again. A light snowfall fell over the region, gentler this time, as if winter were finally granting some reprieve. In the newly softened landscape, Lydia found herself able to breathe more easily. She turned her attention back to her farm chores, checking fences for damage and breaking ice in the animal troughs. Yet her thoughts consistently drifted to the mother bobcat and her cubs at the rehabilitation center. She wondered if their straw bedding was comfortable, if the cubs still batted each other's ears playfully, and how soon the mother might be strong enough to exercise real freedom within a larger enclosure. She called Dr. Patel the next afternoon, hoping for an update. The veterinarian's tone matched the kinder weather outside. "She's definitely improving," Dr. Patel said. "We've started her on short sessions in a more spacious pen. She's still cautious, but her gait is stronger every day. The cubs are healthy enough to roam around with her, sniffing every corner. The center had begun introducing small, live prey, mice and the occasional rat, to gauge the mother's hunting instincts. Dr. Patel noted that, while clumsy at first, the mother bobcat quickly regained her skill, dispatching the prey and teaching her offspring to eat what she provided. "That's the best sign possible," Dr. Patel explained. "It means she remembers how to do what bobcats do. Once she can hunt consistently, we'll evaluate how well the cubs adapt. If all goes well, we'll plan a release once the cubs are old enough to travel safely on their own paws." The prospect of a future release lifted Lydia's mood. She pictured wide fields touched by melting snow, a mother bobcat prowling in search of voles and rabbits, her 2 young ones bounding behind her, each healthy and strong. The mental image was a balm against winter's lingering chill. She thanked Dr. Patel, promising once more to support the center in any way possible. Though a modest part of her wanted to see that release herself, she sensed the bobcat deserved to return to nature without human eyes trailing her every move. Days turned into weeks, and the dull ache of late winter gave way to the first hints of an early spring. Temperatures hovered closer to freezing, and the sun lingered longer in the sky. Lydia continued to check in, hearing the gratifying news that the bobcat family had advanced to an outdoor enclosure on the center's grounds, a place with trees, logs, and hidden corners to explore. Cameras captured the mother stalking and pouncing, once more brimming with the wild energy that had nearly been extinguished in the 48°C nightmare. The cubs, now sporting thicker coats, climbed stumps and batted each other's tails. In one especially heartening report, Dr. Patel mentioned that the mother had successfully taught them to chase a frightened squirrel. "They haven't perfected their technique," Dr. Patel laughed, "but they're learning fast." By early March, the roads were clear enough for Lydia to make a second visit. She arrived at the center on a mild afternoon, the sun bright upon the last crusts of snow. Frank Delgado happened to be there, dropping off a kestrel with a damaged wing. He greeted Lydia with a warm smile. "You won't believe how far they've come," he said, gesturing for her to follow him to the outdoor enclosure. "Brace yourself, they're rowdy now." Dr. Patel led them along a winding path to a secure fence topped with a canopy of wire mesh. Within, the terrain resembled a slice of forest floor, complete with rocks, felled branches, and scattered brush piles. At first, Lydia had trouble spotting the bobcats. Then, in a flash of movement, one cub bounded from behind a log, ears pricked, tail twitching. The mother appeared next, her coat thick and lustrous, her gaze keen as she scanned her surroundings. There was no sign of the frail creature Lydia had found huddled beneath her porch. This was a predator in her prime, balanced on powerful limbs, coat rippling with each shift of muscle. The second cub crept forward, sniffing the fence near where Lydia stood. She carefully kept her distance, remembering Dr. Patel's warnings about minimal human contact. Still, she couldn't resist a soft smile. To her astonishment, the cub planted its tiny paws on the fence, almost as if trying to peer closer. The mother watched from a short distance, tail flicking in disapproval. Then she let out a low yowl, and the cub scampered back to her side. Lydia's heart squeezed with both joy and a faint sadness. She recognized a fierce maternal gesture reminiscent of that night in the mudroom. They belonged to the wild, she reminded herself. Frank pointed to a digital monitor mounted on a pole nearby. "We track their movements. Once the mother consistently demonstrates self-sufficiency, we'll move to the final phase, release planning. The cubs are old enough now to survive with her guidance, especially come spring. We just have to pick the right location, somewhere far from heavy traffic or major predators, but with enough game for them to thrive." Lydia turned to Dr. Patel. "I'd like to support that process in any way I can." Dr. Patel nodded, stepping away from the fence. "Thank you Funds are always welcome, of course, and any local expertise helps. I recall you live on a sizable property. Is it near a designated bobcat habitat? Lydia explained that her homestead stretched across fields that bordered a state wildlife reserve. She described the pine stands and rocky outcrops, the corridors that deer and smaller creatures often used. Dr. Patel exchanged a thoughtful glance with Frank. That might be an option, the vet mused. A release on private land next to protected territory could work, so long as we have permission and clear conditions about leaving them undisturbed. Frank nodded. Bobcats typically roam, but having a safe starting point can be crucial. If Lydia's property meets the criteria, it might be ideal. He looked at Lydia, raising an eyebrow. Would you be okay with that? A jolt of excitement mingled with trepidation in Lydia's chest. I'd be honored, she said, pressing her hand over her heart, but only if it's truly what's best for them. I don't want them confined to my land, obviously. They need to roam wherever nature takes them. We understand, Dr. Patel said, her smile warm. We'd assess the site carefully. Release doesn't mean captivity. It just means a starting point close to good hunting grounds, but away from busy roads. Once they're out there, they're free to move as they like. They wrapped up the conversation with an agreement that Dr. Patel and a small team would visit Lydia's farm in the coming weeks. Lydia lingered by the fence a moment longer, watching the mother bobcat groom one of the cubs. The subtle rise and fall of her sleek back reminded Lydia of the first night, when that back was hunched and trembling with cold. Now the cat radiated quiet strength, wholly restored to her wild grace. The sight lit a spark of gratitude in Lydia's chest. By the time she drove home, the sun was dipping behind pink-tinged clouds. She parked near the barn and took a slow walk around her property, imagining how it might become a stepping-off point for these creatures' second chance. She paused at the porch where she'd found them, remembering the moment she'd shined her flashlight and locked eyes with the half-frozen family. If they were released here, how long would it be before they ranged far, vanishing back into the secret folds of the land? She knew that was the plan, that it was right, but a small pang of loss still nibbled at her. Over the next several days, Lydia tidied the edges of her property, cleared dead branches, and surveyed potential hiding spots. She scouted the perimeter fence, making notes on areas that might be risky if the bobcats moved through, especially where coyotes or other predators might also pass. She understood that conflict was natural, that a fully functional ecosystem included competition, but she hoped to at least minimize hazards near her home. One bright afternoon, Dr. Patel arrived with 2 colleagues, along with Frank, who had insisted on helping with the field assessment. They trudged over Lydia's fields, noting the variety of small game tracks, mostly rabbit and squirrel, as well as water sources and sheltering stands of conifers. The group talked quietly, mapping out vantage points and potential den sites for a newly released feline family. They moved into the wooded area that abutted the reserve, where Frank pointed out an old streambed that, once the snow fully melted, would become an excellent water source for the bobcats. After nearly 2 hours of inspection, the group reconvened by Lydia's porch, stamping snow from their boots. Dr. Patel's expression was thoughtful but clearly pleased. This location seems promising, she said. Plenty of prey, good cover, a connection to protected lands. The mother won't sense heavy human presence aside from you, Lydia, and I suspect she'll steer clear. We'll finalize our plans soon. They're not quite ready yet, but in a few more weeks, I think they'll be good to go. With the site assessment completed, Lydia found herself moving through the tail end of winter with a sense of mounting anticipation. On warmer days, the snow would melt into trickling rivulets, carving shallow channels near her back fence. Then, just as she got used to gentler weather, another cold snap would remind everyone that spring was not fully here yet. Still, each fresh patch of thawed earth felt symbolic, as though nature was preparing a place for the mother bobcat and her cubs. Lydia often walked those areas, mentally picturing how the small family might explore these new territories in cautious wonder. During this period, the Wildlife Center's updates were consistently encouraging. Dr. Patel reported that the bobcat's injuries had fully healed, and her coat had grown back thick and glossy, with no obvious sign of the frostbite scars. The cubs, nearly doubling in size, honed their pouncing and climbing skills every day. They were now able to dispatch small prey on their own, supervised by their vigilant mother. Lydia often marveled at the transformation. Once trembling beneath a porch, now thriving in a secure outdoor enclosure, it seemed like living proof that resilience, paired with a timely helping hand, could conquer grim odds. The proposed release date fell in mid-April, contingent on stable weather and the bobcat's continued progress. Lydia felt her excitement entwined with dread. Though she longed to see them free, she also worried. Would they find enough food if a sudden cold snap returned? Would they wander too far and encounter highways or farmland where they might be shot as pests? She tried to quiet these concerns, reminding herself that wildlife was always a dance of risk and opportunity. At least here, the mother bobcat had every advantage they could provide: supportive terrain, abundant prey, and a watchful human ally. Frank Delgado visited twice in late March, helping Lydia finalize the specifics. They chose a secluded spot near the tree line for the transport crates, away from her own outbuildings and any lingering human scents. The plan was simple: drive the sedated animals to Lydia's property, let them wake in the crates, and then open the doors when it was safe. Ideally, the bobcat would lead the cubs out, reorient herself to the wild, and never look back. A part of Lydia yearned to witness that exact moment, to confirm the mother had regained complete autonomy. Still, she knew to keep her distance. At last, April arrived with a mild breeze that tasted of warmth. The remaining snow receded daily, revealing damp soil beneath. Lydia watched crocuses poke through in defiance of the lingering chill. The date of the release loomed. On a crisp, clear morning, Frank called to confirm that the mother bobcat and her cubs had been tranquilized for transport. Their final checkup deemed them fit for release. Lydia felt her stomach flutter with a mix of joy and anxiety. She half expected a wave of doubt to overtake her, but as she gazed at her newly greening fields, she felt mostly peace. An hour later, Frank's truck rolled up Lydia's driveway, followed closely by a second vehicle from the Wildlife Center. Dr. Patel hopped out, waving cheerily before heading to the cargo area. Lydia followed, nerves jangling. A pair of sturdy metal crates sat secured with straps. Inside the first, the mother bobcat lay sprawled, eyes half-lidded from sedation. Despite her relaxed posture, there was no mistaking the sleek muscle beneath her fur. In the second crate, the cubs dozed in a warm nest of straw, occasionally twitching as though dreaming of their hunts. Lydia's throat tightened, recalling how frail they once seemed. With practiced efficiency, Frank and Dr. Patel carried the crates to the designated release spot near the forest edge. Lydia stood a short distance away, heart thudding in her ears. A hush fell over the small gathering. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Dr. Patel administered a mild reversal agent through the crate's side, gently encouraging the sedative to wear off. The plan was to give the bobcats time to awaken in a calm setting. Lydia clutched her coat, feeling the damp grass underfoot. Within minutes, she saw the mother stir, blinking slowly as she regained awareness. The mother bobcat lifted her head, ears flicking in agitation. She recognized the cage's confines and let out a low, guttural sound. Dr. Patel nodded to Frank, who carefully unlatched the crate's door. He stepped back swiftly, allowing the cat to exit on her own terms. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. At first, the mother only poked her nose out, taking in the smells of soil and early spring air. Then, In a single fluid motion, she emerged. Her head swung around warily, scanning the perimeter. Perhaps she remembered a faint trace of Lydia's farm, though no sign of recognition showed. A moment later, the cubs roused. They mewed inside their crate, stirring to the rustle of fresh grass outside. Frank moved to unlatch their door as well, stepping aside with the same caution. One cub ventured out first, wide-eyed at the new landscape. The second followed, stumbling briefly before regaining balance. Seeing them free, Lydia's eyes welled. She stayed rooted in place, resisting the urge to crouch closer. The mother bobcat turned at the cub's sounds, then padded over. She sniffed them carefully, as if double-checking their safety, before flicking her tail in a gesture that seemed to say, "Keep moving." Slowly, the trio set off into the undergrowth, each step more confident than the last. Lydia held her breath, watching tawny shapes melt into the emerging green. Though her eyes stung with tears, a gentle pride spread through her. This was true release, not a sentimental goodbye, but a triumph of survival. Once, they had been half-frozen strangers beneath her porch. Now, they were free. At last, only silence remained. Lydia exhaled, carrying that silence in her heart. Nothing in that moment felt more perfectly whole. Long after the mother bobcat and her cubs disappeared into the thick brush, Lydia and the others remained standing in silence. They listened for a rustle, a snap of twigs, or any sign that the felines might linger. Nothing emerged but the faint whisper of wind weaving through the pines. At last, Dr. Patel and Frank exchanged satisfied smiles, confirming that the release had gone as smoothly as anyone could hope. Lydia, unable to keep tears entirely at bay, dabbed at her eyes. She felt the final shards of worry dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of elation. Over the following week, Lydia settled back into her routine with a newfound calm. Each morning she wandered toward the wooded edge of her property, pausing whenever she thought she heard the distant crack of undergrowth. More than once she spotted faint paw prints in the damp soil, though she could not be certain which creature had left them. She told herself not to search too hard, reminding herself that the bobcats were free now, guided by instincts older than memory. Yet she found comfort in the possibility that they might remain close, at least until the cubs grew strong enough to roam far. One sunny afternoon, as she tidied the barn, Lydia heard a sudden chorus of alarmed crows echoing from the tall pines. Her heart skipped. She crept outside, scanning the tree line. Through shifting patches of light and shade, she glimpsed movement, a lithe, tawny shape slipping silently between trunks. For a moment she thought she saw the telltale flick of a stubbed bobcat tail, but she couldn't be sure. The shape vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her with a small, tremulous smile. Perhaps they'd chosen to stay nearby a little longer, testing the boundaries of this strange shared domain. A few days later, Frank phoned to check in, asking if Lydia had seen any sign of the bobcats. She admitted only to fleeting glimpses, footprints that might or might not be theirs, and an overwhelming sense that something wild lingered at the edge of her awareness. Frank laughed, telling her that the Wildlife Center had tracked no complaints about bobcats in the area, a good sign that the mother and her cubs were integrating without conflict. They shared a brief moment of gratitude, recalling how close those animals had come to perishing in that lethal storm. Now, all evidence pointed toward success. Spring arrived in earnest over the following weeks. Wildflowers erupted in splashes of yellow and purple along the edges of Lydia's fields. Birds returned in singing flocks, and the air grew warm enough to leave windows open. She spent more time in her vegetable garden, grateful to feel the sun on her back. Whenever she heard rustling from the pines, she paused to listen, a gentle wonder stirring in her chest. Sometimes she thought about the mother bobcat patrolling those shadows, teaching her cubs to stalk and climb, It comforted her to imagine them weaving through the tapestry of renewed life just beyond her fence. One afternoon, Dr. Patel invited Lydia to a small gathering at the Wildlife Center, an educational event celebrating successful rehabilitations. They showcased photos and videos of various rescues, including an orphaned fox, an injured hawk, and an emaciated wolf recovered from a trap. Though the Bobcat family's story was not singled out, Lydia recognized certain images from their time in rehab. Her eyes misted as she watched a brief clip of the mother bobcat batting a ball of twine, testing her reflexes. Dr. Patel later thanked Lydia publicly, crediting her swift intervention for saving 3 precious lives. Lydia blushed at the applause. After the event, Lydia meandered outside, watching the sun cast long shadows across the center's parking lot. She felt the warmth of early evening on her face. Dr. Patel joined her, sharing a quiet smile. They spoke of the larger mission that united them: humans and wildlife coexisting on overlapping land, forging unexpected alliances when necessity demanded it. "You gave them a chance that cold night," Dr. Patel said, her voice gentle. "Most people never encounter a truly wild animal in such dire need. But you did, and you listened to your instincts." Lydia nodded, recalling the sheer desperation in those feral eyes. As the weeks passed, Lydia shifted her focus to spring planting, preparing rows for tomatoes, beans, and squash. Life on the farm settled into familiar rhythms. She rose early, fed her chickens, checked fences, and readied her soil. Yet she remained alert, savoring any subtle sign that wild neighbors roamed just beyond view. Sometimes she discovered fresh claw marks on a weathered tree trunk, or found rabbit fur scattered near the pines. These clues spoke of predators claiming their rightful domain. A quiet pride blossomed in Lydia's heart, knowing her land had contributed to their second chance, weaving another thread into nature's vast tapestry. Early one morning, she was tending to the garden when a distant shape appeared at the tree line. Though it was barely dawn, she made out a strong feline silhouette. Lydia froze, heart pounding. The form stood motionless for an instant, then turned its head, revealing pointed ears and that distinctive profile. Even from a distance, Lydia sensed the cat's vivid awareness. She wondered if it was the mother bobcat herself, drawn again to the edges of this shared domain. A wisp of connection stirred in Lydia's chest as they regarded one another. Then the creature slipped away, leaving footprints to vanish in the dewy grass. That fleeting moment became her glimpse, yet it was enough. Lydia felt the old magic return. 2 mothers bound by an unforgiving winter night and a shared will to protect the helpless. By season's end, she realized their story had come full circle. The Bobcat family thrived somewhere in the wild, sustained by instincts older than fear. Grateful to have played one role, Lydia returned to her fields each day, renewed in spirit.